morning, everyone. Some of you may remember me from a number of months ago when I led an exercise in priority setting about a group of tourists who were stranded in a cave, and you had to pick which ones were getting saved and which ones weren't. So some of you may find my face a little familiar. For those of you who don't, as Ian introduced, my name is Ian Cromwell. I was born here in 1984. We moved to the interior and then out to the nether wastelands, also known as Toronto. And I did 2 degrees, one at Waterloo and one at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Before moving back here, I work for the British Columbia Cancer Agency now. But what I'm going to be talking to you about today has nothing to do with my professional background or anything that I'm really all that qualified to talk about. I'm not a historian, and unlike Newt Gingrich, I don't pretend to be one. So I'm just going to be talking to you about some of the things that I spend a lot of my free time discussing and learning about and examining to do with Black history in Canada and how our history can inform our attitudes, how it informs our attitudes today, and how it can inform what we want to do in the future. I don't know how many of you were taught what we call Black history in Canada and Canadian schools. It tends to be, hey look, here's a list of things that Black people had invented. Isn't that neat? And then that's the end of it. And it's frustrating for me because that's not how we teach any other kind of history. We don't have a list of inventors of things and then say, and now we know Canadian history because Canadians invented penicillin and now we know that. So there are a number of reasons why, and I won't really go into all of them, why we seem to give Black history short shrift. Many of you know this is Black History Month. The question often comes up, why do we have a Black History Month? Why don't we have a this group History Month and that group History Month and that group History Month? Why don't we just make all months History Month? And that is a good question, except for the fact that Black history is unique, perhaps uniquely understudied, particularly in Canada. And that has partially to do with this myth that we have about Canadian post-racial tolerance. And we contrast sort of our experience to the experience of our neighbors to the south. And we say, we did it a whole lot better than they did it, so problem solved. And the number of Black people in Canada is small enough that we can get away with that because the lobby of people saying we need to do a better job studying Black history is really, really tiny. And so we intentionally leave our history unexamined. And I think that does us a lot of harm for reasons that I'll go into today. So I want to start this off with a bit of a, not really a thought experiment, perhaps an analogy. Imagine you are stranded on a lifeboat somewhere in the ocean, and you don't know which direction the land is. You have to start paddling somewhere. What piece of information would be crucially helpful in order for you to know which direction you should be paddling in? Well, if you knew where you came from, if you knew the general direction that you had come from before you ended up in that lifeboat, that would orient you to where you won't end up paddling off into the middle of the ocean. You might have to go back to where you started, but at least you get some orientation of where you came from. And in the same sense, understanding our history is crucial. Understanding where we came from and how we came to be where we are today helps inform not only how we are where we are, or why we're here, but where we want to go next. Black history in Canada is actually not that different from Black history in the United States. It tends to be the repeated collisions of de facto Black community, which is a discussion maybe for another time, against sort of arrayed forces of white supremacy. And often that comes with official government license, that comes with the force of legislation behind it. I want to go through 3 just general examples of this phenomenon. You can see that it tends to be the same story just repeated again and again and again in different times and in different places. One of the foundational myths of Black history is the Underground Railroad and how escaped slaves came from the United States to the promised land in the north, and where everything was fine and there was no racism and everyone was happy. And of course, I mean, we know how ridiculous that is, but that is how it's taught. That Canada didn't have slavery because Canada was part of the British Empire, and the British Empire abolished slavery. Canada starts a lot way before the 19th century, when sometimes we forget that. Canada, central Canada particularly, and eastern Canada to a great extent as well, was built largely on slave labor. And this is something that perhaps goes often unexplored. Between the late 19th century and then the official abolition of slavery in the, did I say 17th slavery? Sorry, late 17th century and early 19th century, in that intervening 100 and so years, before the official abolition of slavery in the British Empire, Canada was no different from any other major power in the world that it used slave labor. To definitely a lesser numerical extent the United States did, because we didn't have the plantation system here, which means that our need for agricultural labor was much less than it was in the southern United States. But still, all walks of life, especially the elite, including, interestingly, perhaps more so for this group, clergy members, bishops, and higher ranks in the church, had slaves, owned slaves, defended slavery using biblical, from biblical sources. So the laboring underclass, the porters, the servants, the non-skilled labor, much of it was provided by imported Black Canadians. I want to read you a quote from the first British governor of the Quebec territory. So this is, just sort of put it in a context, this is General James Murray, who's the first British governor of Quebec after capitulation of France, ceding the new territory of what I guess would be, well, central Canada, Ontario and Quebec, to the British government. And he took over, and he sent this letter to New York. I must most earnestly entreat your assistance. Without servants, nothing can be done. Had I the inclination to employ soldiers, which is not the case, they would disappoint me. And Canadians will work for nobody but themselves. Black slaves are certainly the only people to be dependent on. Now, as much as Black people would love to be thought of as being dependable, that's perhaps not the best context for it. So the attitudes of that support slavery, particularly of Blacks, that existed everywhere at the time, existed here as well. Eastern Canada, we have a much richer knowledge of Black history and Black experience in Eastern Canada. The first Black settlers in particularly Nova Scotia, but everywhere in the Atlantic region, were imported slaves, and then shortly thereafter, Black loyalists who left the British Empire, left with the British Empire after the Revolutionary War in the United States, and they settled in Nova Scotia. These Black men and women, although it was Black men solely serving the military, they were led to believe that they would be fighting and supporting the abolition of slavery in this new territory, because that was sort of the British doctrine. What ended up happening instead is that after these men served their empire, they were given 1-acre plots of land on the outskirts of white settlements, whereas white loyalists were given plots of land that were 15 acres up to upwards of 100. This fertile land was given to the white soldiers, and then the Black soldiers were given the remnants. And in fact, there's some suggestion that if a white loyalist desired a piece of land that was owned by a Black loyalist, they would just take it, and that would be it. The government wouldn't intervene because that was the attitude of the time. Many of you may be familiar with the Saga of Africville, which is a more recent event. In the outskirts, just outside the settlement of Halifax, there was what is essentially a ghetto, built, settled by black people who were not allowed to live in the city. They were allowed to labor there, but they weren't allowed to live and build houses. Most residents of Africville didn't own their own property. It was all rental at a rate that was well above what could be afforded in order to save up to purchase. And not being content to give them the scrub land on the outskirts, they also moved in a sewage treatment plant and a recycling facility. They didn't provide sewage or adequate potable water to this settlement. And then in 1960, they decided, we've had enough of this eyesore, and so they tore it down, displacing all of the people who had lived there for generations, buying out the very small number of homeowners for a pittance, essentially, and then they just razed the whole thing to the ground. And it was only after years of fighting that this sort of became enough traction underneath it to elevate to the status of a national scandal. But that's the reason why we have a much richer understanding of the Black experience there, because it was and continues to be a really big deal. Finally, Western Canada. We can all pat ourselves on the back in history, I suppose, because historically, the experience of Black settlers in early British Columbia was comparatively the best, so yay us. Which isn't to say that we didn't face systemic racism or didn't participate in systemic racism here, but what it does mean is that grading on a curve, we got the A+, so we're all very proud. But in the prairie provinces, it's actually quite a bit different. Whereas Black importation of slaves in central Canada happened in the late 17th century and earlier, and the settling of eastern Canada happened in the late 17th, mostly mid-19th centuries, and obviously some of the 18th century as well. It wasn't until the late 19th century that Blacks began moving into the prairie provinces. Many of you who've studied Canadian history know how important the intentional sending of settlers, particularly immigrant settlers, to Western Canada was in the foundation of Canada, that the prairie provinces would not have existed, would not be able to prosper without major giveaways in terms of land and tools. And this did happen to a lot of immigrants, but only to the right kind of immigrants. There was an active, almost Jim Crow style policy of exclusion of Black immigrants in the prairie provinces. This came with, the official federal seal of approval. There were, officially segregationist policies on the books. The city of Edmonton in 1911 actually passed a ban on Black people in 1911. This is not a million years ago. This is barely 100 years ago, where they said, if you're Black, you're not allowed to live in Edmonton. Which I suppose isn't really that much of a punishment, but we'll move past. But again, the same policy of giving the inferior land to Black settlers. Black migrants were charged the fee for their fare to get from Eastern Canada, where many of them lived, into the West, whereas it was free for whites. There were extra medical tests. Many of you may be familiar with the concept of a poll tax that was part of the Jim Crow segregation era, where there were additional tests for qualification levied on Black Americans, so that they had to, count the number of bubbles on a bar of soap as an IQ test to prove that they were smart enough to vote. Ridiculous policies, but you have to be qualified, and it wasn't official. It wasn't officially on the books racism, but it carried the same force and effect. Canada, in its part, subjected Black settlers, but not white settlers, to additional medical procedures because they had to prove that we could survive in the harsh Canadian climate, whereas white people were naturally, more fortified and capable of dealing with the harsh winters. Blacks were considered, not quite so, let's use the word, dependable. The interesting, of course, counterfactual to that is that black settlement, actually, rates of staying on the homestead were higher for blacks than they were for whites. Maybe having to jump through all those extra hoops was a bit of cream skimming, so that the people who actually made it out there were the tough ones who were able to survive. So as you can see, we're not sort of innocent of the exact same kinds of horror stories that we hear from the United States. The issue is that we don't focus our attention on them. And like I said, I think that does us a disservice, because the question we have to ask ourselves is, would better understanding of the facts of our history give us a better idea of why we have the contemporary racial issues that we have? I was surprised to learn that more than half of the black people currently living in Canada have immigrated since 1991. More than half since 91, which I think is pretty crazy. In 1961 was the last time that Canada officially had a racist immigration policy, like an officially we are racist immigration policy, whereby certain groups were disqualified based on race alone. There's still ongoing problems with the distribution of poverty, of housing, and recently a report has come out saying that our prison population is disproportionately black. We are facing these issues today. Would we be able to better deal with our contemporary problems if we had a better understanding of the historical facts that underpin them? With the current friction between Haitian immigrant families in Quebec and the Franco families who've been there for generations, would we better understand that if we understood the history of slavery and racial attitudes in central Canada? Recently there was a cross burned on the lawn of an interracial couple outside Halifax. The Africville Commission just tried to hire a new president. The person that they hired was white, and there was a major controversy over this issue, and many people sort of said, I don't understand why this is a problem. Would we be better equipped to deal with these problems if we understood the history of Africville, if that was part of our national story? Many of you may have heard recently about the resurgence of the Blood and Honor hate group, white supremacist Aryan group here in Western Canada. Would we have a better understanding of why these attitudes exist with such popularity here if we understood the history of the black experience in Western Canada? And so finally, we can get to the second question, which is perhaps the more practical one, which is how would better understanding our history equip us to deal with the problems that are going to be coming in the future? We have new immigrant groups arriving all the time. Canada cannot survive without immigration, which leads to a clash of cultures, not only clashes of cultures of different groups, but in our eternal struggle to settle on what is a Canadian identity, how do we navigate the inherent conflict between wanting to be Canadian and wanting to not be racist, wanting to not be white supremacist, wanting to involve all Canadians, regardless of their ethnic background, as being Canadian? How do we do that? It seems to be the same exact problem, and we have a rich wealth of mistakes that we've already made. And by ignoring those mistakes, we end up in a situation where we may be paddling out into water that's not going to get us any closer to where we want to be, but it's actually going to end up with us capsizing. So these are the questions that I think we can explore our own history, and if we're honest and we don't shrink from it, we will end up with being much better equipped to deal with these problems in the future. Thank you for your attention, and I'm hoping that you have some questions or some discussion points that you'd like to raise.